Hello, everyone. Welcome to Latter-day Struggles. This is your host, Valerie. Pleased and delighted to be with you all here today, and also with a dear friend of mine, Jeff Strong. Hi, Jeff.
Hi, Valerie. It's so good to see you. It's been a while, but happy to hear about all the good things going on in your life.
Yes, it is so good to see you, to be with you. It's always good to visit with you. Jeff has been such a kind, loving friend and support to me and my family pretty much ever since we started the Latter-day Struggles podcast. We were connected, and incidentally, we were connected because I was made aware of Jeff's research on a book that he was writing a few years ago. And actually, here we are. Here we are to talk about the book. It has been published very recently, and we are here to spend 3 conversations together talking about the book Torn. So before we jump into that, though, I do want to direct you all back to the most recent podcast series that Jeff and I did together, because it is actually talking about this subject at large, the question of Mormon faith crisis. And Jeff and I sort of touch on some larger themes connected to what at that point in time was a forthcoming book. Now it is a published book, but that series is titled Mormon Faith Crisis, Progression, Not Pathology. That's episodes 393, 395, and 397 of the Latter-day Struggles podcast. And they are gold. They're very, very good. Lots and lots of downloads. And so if this conversation that Jeff and I have in the next 3 weeks interests you and you want to go deeper and hear about some things that we don't talk about in this series on purpose, the reason why we don't talk about them is there are quite a few things that we talked about in the series before. So we're going to pivot to some conversations about this book. And before we jump into the nitty-gritty of it, Jeff, I would just love for you to say hello, give us a little bit of a background of who you are and why you wrote the book Torn.
Yeah, man. First of all, it's so good to be with you, and it's good to be with your audience. And I hope that our conversation today will be helpful to everyone. I'm just kind of your classic Utah Latter-day Saint. I grew up in Springville, Utah. I did BYU mission, temple marriage, family, bishop, taught at BYU, advised the church, went on a mission as a mission president with my wife, Sarah, and, had kind of a normal playbook, run-of-the-mill life until I didn't. And so it started when, the journey that ultimately led me to the book started 13 years ago when my oldest son, Cale, sent me an email from the MTC. And in that email, he said, "I'm not going to do this." And I don't want to over dramatize the moment, but 13 years ago, based on where my family was and where my head was at, it was absolutely like somebody came into my house in the middle of the night and ransacked it. And I felt that kind of overwhelming, sadness, despair, fear, anxiety, confusion. And I was serving as a bishop at the same time. And they did a split in our ward. And so from 2 wards, they made 3. And I went from 1 ward to being the bishop of the new ward right when all this was going on. And I go into this new ward, and there are all these salt of the earth Latter-day Saint families that are leaving. And so the bottom line is, in 2013, the narrative that was so common about why people leave, and by the way, it's still pretty common, that, hey, they just didn't have the faith and character to be Latter-day Saints. It just made no sense to me. I was saying, well, that's not my son, and that's not these wonderful families in our ward. That's not them. And my stubborn brain couldn't let go of that. It was like, look, when the words and the pictures don't match, I need to understand. And so that started a long journey that ultimately led me to where we are right now.
Wow. Love what you're sharing. And what I also love, Jeff, is how in some ways you and I share quite a bit in common, meaning that we both have such a love for, the primary language of our faith, for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And also we have a unique way of manifesting that love. And that love is in the courage to talk about hard things. Mm-hmm. And what I love about this work that you've done that I think really gives a lot of credence and value to what you're sharing with us in this book that you have just published is that you talk about these things from the context of somebody who cares about the church, who's candid enough to talk about what's, really going on in a population of people who are in pain. Well, I think it's two populations of people in pain, right? And both sides of the
Yeah.
question, everyone's in pain. And also, you validate these things with hard numbers. You did extensive research, both qualitative and quantitative research. So we're talking interviews and surveys to understand what is actually going on in the disaffiliation that is rampant in 2026 in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It didn't start now. It's actually, it's increasing. And we're going to talk more about that later. But Jeff took his experience, his personal experience of not knowing how to make sense of what was going on in his own family life and in his own ward. And he decided to sort of do what he could to make sense of it. And the Torn book is the product of this labor of love that it's been years and years that you've sort of been putting this together. Is that correct?
Yeah, really, it's been 13 years. And then from the time I first put pen to paper and started to write, it's been 4 years. I estimate 13,000, or excuse me, 3,000 hours. I've rewritten the book 22 times. Last summer, I literally lit it on fire and started over. I got some very tough love feedback from a good friend. And he just said, I won't use his name, although many of your listeners would probably know who he is, and he's a best-selling author. But he just said, Jeff, he said, I've learned from my books that the first time you write the book, you write what you want, and then you light it on fire and you write what is needed. you know. And so it was a humbling but cathartic moment where I stepped back and said, okay, I need to. He said, and Valerie, this might get into some of what I know you want to talk about, but he said, you cannot change things with torches and pitchforks.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
Wow.
so I took that feedback to heart and started over.
Wow. And I'm sure we're going to better understand that as we go deeper into the actual content of the book.
Yeah.
So what I want to share with you all, I'm going to just spend a moment being very candid with you, my listeners out there, who I think I know and love you enough to know why you come here and what you expect from a podcast episode and series. And so I'm going to talk to you all a little bit like Jeff isn't in the room here, although he is in the room and he knows what I'm about ready to say. Okay. Here's the deal, y'all. This book is not written for you as the primary audience. Okay. So I want you to read this book, but when you read it, I want you to read it through the lens of your more devout loved ones. And what I mean by that is that in an effort to help our more traditionally believing Latter-day Saint loved ones understand what is going on in the faith crisis world here and now in the LDS Church, it's crucial to do this gently and to meet people where they are. I've often talked in this podcast about the concept of a window of tolerance, meaning that in order for us to learn, we have to be able to tolerate something that is a little bit uncomfortable. But if we move, if someone, even a loving someone or an idea is beyond our window of tolerance, it doesn't matter how good, true, beautiful, or important it is, we will not be able to hear it and we will put the book down. We will turn the podcast off. And so what Jeff has done in this book, and I have read it very closely, and I've actually been on the peripheries of the writing process for over 2 years in friendship and consultation together, is Jeff has had, he's taken the time to couch some very hard and complicated truths about what's going on in the faith crisis realm in the LDS Church, but he's done this in a way that I think has very beautifully and powerfully helped or will be helping our Latter-day Saint devout loved ones stay present. And so this is all just to say, this is a little comical, but I'm giving you a little bit of a trigger warning. If and when you read the book Torn, you will be reading a book written for your more devout loved ones. You are going to hear a lot of validating quotes by authoritative church leaders. Okay. You're going to hear a lot of case studies and examples and illustrations from the Doctrine and Covenants, from the Book of Mormon, from sort of like our Mormon, uh, the typical Mormon correlated way that we sort of talk about and validate how we see the world. And you're going to notice a lot of languaging and the way that we talk culturally as more devout Latter-day Saints. That is used in this book, and it's used for a reason. Okay. So that's my number one, like sort of, I don't know, caution or something that I want you to be aware of so that you, when you read this book, you can get as much out of it as I did. Number 2 point that I want to just share with you before we jump more deeply in to the content of the book itself is that it occurred to me as I was reading this and getting a little bit uncomfortable from time to time about things that weren't being discussed, is as soon as it occurred to me what Jeff was doing and why, I just fell in love with this book. And I really, really want everyone to have this book, to read it, and to give it to your more devout loved ones, because I think it has the capacity to be transformational. Okay. And also keep in mind that one of the things that Jeff chose to do in the writing of this book is he is discussing downstream issues, not upstream issues. Okay. And let me just clarify what that means. Not, let me say that. Let me think about this. Okay. So let me just define what upstream versus downstream is first, and then we'll talk about how it applies. So upstream issues is prevention. Okay. How to prevent something from happening. Downstream issues is the opposite of that. It's how to mitigate or how to help work with something that has already happened. It could be called recovery or repair. Jeff is not addressing or approaching the upstream struggles in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Now, I will say that couched in a lot of gentle language, he does mention SEC violations. He does mention underreporting of sex abuse. He does mention struggles with authoritarianism, struggles with patriarchy. It's there, and I kind of like cheered when I saw it. But that is not the main point, because we're trying to stay inside of the window of tolerance of the intended audience. But what he does focus on is the downstream issue of when somebody has a faith crisis, that already is a trauma that happens inside of themselves. It's an intrapersonal trauma where one's identity is being fractured, okay? But what he decides to address is actually a double trauma that happens after the faith crisis, when there is the trauma of isolation and judgment by loved ones in the ward, in the family, in the marriage. So the downstream issue that he addresses in the book Torn is, once one has a faith crisis, once these things are learned about and understood and causing a great deal of distress inside of a human being, what can we as a church community do to nurture and love that person once that thing upstream has already happened? So if you have those two paradigms in mind, I think you will be able to dig into this book and see the beauty and goodness and potential bridges that can be built as our more devout loved ones read it and start to understand a different way to approach us and to even see what's happening in our lives as we have experienced a lot of pain and suffering through our faith crisis. Okay, I feel like my homily
Yeah.
is over. Go ahead, Jeff. Go ahead and respond.
Yeah, I just want to thank you. I love how you framed that. And there's a little more I can add that might bring some texture, but I literally got a text this morning. And if it's okay, I'd like to read it because I think it's a real example of what you just described. So this text is from a friend, but somebody that is extremely devout and orthodox, and that in prior conversations with, I sensed quite a bit of anxiety in them about what I was doing and what I was talking about. And there was a bit of shutting down, their window of tolerance, Valerie, would close. And so they just finished the book and they sent me this text today. Hi, Jeff, I just finished reading Torn today. Your book changed my heart. It brought clear vision and forced me to ponder issues that, frankly, I had never given much thought to. I will never be the same.
Wow. That's what we want.
Yeah, and so if you feel cringy at times as you're going through this book, just remember this text. And then this individual went on to say, "Thank you for sharing your tender personal story and helping your readers see more as Christ sees." And so it's a tiny needle here that I'm trying to thread. And it was a challenge. 22 times I rewrote this book, 22 times I revised it. And finally, my editor, who by the way is very devout, very traditional, she finally said, "Jeff, books are never done; they're only published." You know, it was her way of getting me to let go and just send the book out. You know,
Yeah.
and so I'm sure there are things I could have done better.
And that's okay, right? I mean, in my mind, I think about how you and I are both trying to do by serving these two respective audiences, right? In other words, I would, it's interesting that like you and I maybe on the one hand I might be nurturing some of the deep pain and suffering of, say for example, a wife in a marriage, where you're actually nurturing the pain and suffering of the husband in that
Yeah,
same marriage. And so we are serving conceivably one single family that metaphorically is, you could take that a few steps back and say our church right now is a representation of, we're all across the spectrum, but I'm sad to see that like what we're really doing is gathering at two opposite poles.
yeah,
And
yeah,
you and I are trying to uh, create a paradigm, or create language and dialogue and ways to think about the faith and the faith experience of growth in a way that doesn't divide, but in a way that creates bridges of understanding and connection where people don't necessarily even need to end or expect that ending in the same place is the only way that people can experience Christ-like love in a marriage, in a family, in a ward. And that's, I think, what both of us are actually trying to do.
yeah. Valerie, so well said. You know, can I share something that's kind of emerged as this conversation has unfolded over the last 2 months?
Yeah.
So, I've spent so much time talking to people, doing focus groups, one-on-one interviews, of course, the big surveys, that I've learned a lot, right? So I'm not like short on learning, but I'm still learning, you know. And there's something that surfaced more recently in this conversation, and it's the idea of mixed faith marriages. And it's not Catholic with Episcopalian, it's two Latter-day Saints in the same marriage that have very different beliefs. And so many people have reached out to me over the last 2 months to say, "This is the situation I'm in. We're really struggling to work through this." And these are couples that love each other, that have families, children together, and they are struggling. And so this is a huge pain point in our community. I thought it was common. It's even more common than I realized.
Yeah. Yes, I couldn't agree more. That is one of the most, I would say, a population in the most pain in the Mormon, the Mormon faith experience right now. It's the main population that I work with in my consultations.
Yeah.
And also I've mentioned this before, but I'm actually working with Signature to write a book to the
Oh,
mixed faith
fantastic.
marriage. Yeah, and it's such a tender place because on the one hand, I truly believe that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints cares about marriage and cares about family, and also at the same time, what is unfolding without having conversations, without having dialogue to help couples of this nature better understand and love one another as they are, where they are. We are losing some marriages and some families unnecessarily because they've been able to handle all sorts of very challenging things in their marriage until they hit this one. And sometimes they come to an impasse and cannot overcome it. And that's why we need to be able to help create language and understanding and build these bridges that I believe your book is instrumental in building for couples, for families, and multi-generational families like you and your son. And so, yeah, I feel very strongly about this and could not endorse this book more highly because it provides enough security and safety and understanding of the value that the church holds in the life of a more devout person, while also giving them an opportunity to see through new eyes, to see what's going on. That is a bit of a counter narrative than I think sometimes what people hear, maybe a general conference or some of the rhetoric that goes on that's sort of telling the story of the person who has left the faith or who is deeply struggling with the faith. In some ways, those of us who have had faith expanding experiences, our stories are being told on our behalf, right? And what we're experiencing is not what is being told. And your book does a beautiful job of talking about that. So what I'd like to do, if I may, Jeff, could we pivot over to a little bit more about some of the background, like the numbers, because I think this is
Yeah,
how your
yeah.
book starts. You start the book by talking about, or in some ways, I think what you're actually doing is you're setting us, you're framing up the book first and foremost to say, by the way, this is happening, because that right there is something that I think we're hearing a couple of counter narratives, right? That what's going on is, uh, that there's there's some of this conversation about disaffiliation and about falling away, and then we sometimes, at least I have heard, no, 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 that's not happening. We're thriving more than ever, and again, you do this very gently, but you also share your research from the gate to sort of, I think, frame up like this is something that's happening. And rather than shying away from it or creating some sort of a counter narrative, let's just talk about it. So go ahead and talk
Yeah.
about what are these, what are the numbers, the disaffiliation numbers, and what are the reasons why they leave?
Yeah, let's dive into that. And Valerie, what I'll do is I'll kind of cite the findings. I'll try to do that, concisely. And then I'll actually give you the counter narratives and I'll tell you why they're incomplete.
Okay.
It's not that they're fundamentally wrong, they're just incomplete. You know the old notion of when you testify in a court of law, you testify to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So some of the counter narratives are telling the truth, but not the whole truth,
Yeah.
right? And so it confuses people. And when you have command of the facts, the counter narratives all of a sudden kind of evaporate and blend together because both can be true at the same time. And so I'll just start at the top here. So in the book and in our research, we estimate that 40% of once completely faithful and active members of the church have stepped away over the last 25 years. Okay. Now, let me tell you how we derived that estimate. First of all, we did our survey, and I won't go too much into the gory details of the mechanics unless you want me to, but we did our survey. We asked the question 3 different ways to kind of try to triangulate around potential bias or just misremembering. And all 3 questions produced an answer in the low to mid 40% range. Okay. And then we looked at national studies that have been done by highly reputable organizations to calibrate, right? And so if our centerline estimate was about 40% and all the available studies done by others said 10%, well, we would have had a tremendous sense of anxiety about our data, right? But that isn't what happened, you know. And so the most reliable study out there is the Pew Religious Landscape Studies. They're done every 7 to 10 years. And they peg Latter-day Saint disaffiliation at about 46% during slightly different time frame, right? And so you don't directly compare those numbers, but you say, okay, our study was in low to mid 40s. Pew says roughly the same thing, and they are a nationally representative study. The third study is the Harvard Cooperative Election Study, which is it's not a nationally representative study, and there are a few methodological limitations to the Harvard study, but most serious researchers would say it's an extremely high quality, world class, reliable study. They peg the number in the same range. Now they actually peg it at higher if you take 2025 into account, but let's throw 2025 out for a minute. If you just look at through 2024 in the mid 40s, right? And then there's one more called the General Social Survey, which is done by the University of Chicago. Same thing, right? So you have 4 independent, high quality studies, Pew being probably the highest quality. They all peg the number in the same range. So we did a centerline estimate of about 40%. Could be higher, probably isn't lower, but could be a little lower. And we think 40% is a reasonable number.
Okay, I want to just have you repeat again, if you would, at the very beginning of this conversation, just because I want to be I want us to be very clear on what you just said there. In the last 25 years, an estimated 40-ish% of active, we're talking like transgenerational, lifelong members have left the church. Am I getting that right, Jeff?
Yeah, the way that we identified them is we asked them, when you were your most active, how active were you? And if they answered very active or completely active, we then asked the follow-up question of, what's your status now? So these were people that self-identified as having been very or completely active.
Okay. So what we're looking at is, incidentally, and this is why you and I would talk off and on about this as you're writing the book. This is my exact population of people that listen to the Latter-day
Yeah.
Struggles podcast, right? I've borrowed this joke from one of my group members who said I wasn't active in the church. I was hyperactive in the church.
Yeah, yeah.
And so we're talking about a demographic of people that were not either the very brand new convert that may have not exactly even acclimated into the church, right? Or even somebody who may have been a child of record who never really integrated into the church. Those are very different, albeit important
They are.
demographics. We're
They are.
talking about the person who very, very likely was integrated in through the youth program, who went on a mission, who married in the temple, who went through institute, or maybe went to one of the church universities. We're talking about people that were raising their children in the church, going through all
Yes.
the programs. This is, to me, a huge deal because we're
Yeah.
talking about people whose identities are deeply,
Mhm.
deeply formed in this faith tradition, who must have felt, and I can speak for this firsthand all day long and with the people I work with, this was agonizing for them because it was deeply a part of who they are. And therefore, because it's so deeply a part of how they self-defined and were, and how their characters were formed, it had to have been something pretty painful
Mhm.
that caused them to make this choice that it was going to have massive consequences, traumatic in and of itself, but also like reverberations relationally. So I would love it if you would maybe spend some time talking about what you learned. You found four different, like I guess, groups of people or reasons, or waves, I think is what you called them in the book. These waves of people. Say a little bit about what they said as to their
Yeah.
reasons of disaffiliation.
Yeah, happy to do that. And hey, by the way, just for point of reference, there hasn't been a lot of criticism of the book yet. There's been a little bit of criticism of some of our research methods, and we can talk that, now or later if you want. Nothing that we weren't aware of, and nothing that we actually didn't put very transparently in the book. But nobody's really pushed back on the 40% number.
Yeah.
And now the reason they haven't is you can't really it's with four different studies confirming the same thing. It's hard to push back. Hey Valerie, before I dive into the waves, do you want me to talk about the counter narrative at all? Just to
Sure.
yeah, let me just to close that out. I don't want to spend a lot of time over it, but look, there are two narratives that are false. One narrative is the church is collapsing, and the church is declining in real membership in big ways. That's not correct. It's just not correct. And there are people who believe that and push that narrative. The other narrative is the church is growing like crazy and has never grown faster, and we're doing well in every age cohort. That's also not correct. And so the truth is, as it often is, somewhere in the middle. And so it is true that we baptized 386,000, I think it was 386,000 people in 2025. That was the highest number of convert baptisms ever. And then in 2024, it was about 317,000, which I think, or 309,000, which I think was the highest since 1997. And so there are a lot of people that in the last couple of years have joined the church. Um, but that doesn't mean people aren't simultaneously disaffiliating, right? And I think a pretty good rule of thumb, I wouldn't have anybody like do 3 decimal point calculations with the numbers I'm going to give you now. But over the last 25 years, the church members of record in the United States have increased about 60% over 25 years. Okay. That's the number of members of record. And that's what we often hear people talk about when they're talking about the narrative of thriving. But the number of wards in the United States has only increased 11%. That's probably a better estimate of real growth. And the difference between 60 and 11 would be converts that don't stay active and people that disaffiliate. And we chose the term disaffiliate for a reason. You have to affiliate before you can disaffiliate. And so a convert that joins the church and never really becomes active wouldn't have disaffiliated. They would just have been inactive, right? So your profile of those who are disaffiliating, I think, is largely accurate. So that's the counter narrative. And the truth is, the church in the United States, according to many people that track this very carefully, has grown modestly over the last 25 years. That growth has flattened over the last 6 or 7 years. And one researcher who I respect a lot, who does good work, Matt Martinich, by the way, who's an active Latter-day Saint, he projects that the church in the United States declined very slightly for the first time last year, right? So think of it as modest growth over 25 years, flattening, and then starting to, I'll just call it flat.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, while that's happening, people are disaffiliating and people are joining, and the net is about flat.
So when I read just to give you all just like a lay of the land, is what Jeff's talking about. He goes into more detail actually in one of his appendices at the back. Jeff, can you tell how much I studied your book? I,
Yes, you did. I was
so,
grateful and proud of you as well.
uh, well, I'm clearly very interested in this topic, and just to see how it all like went, how it all came out after having looked at some
Yeah.
of your drafts in the last couple of years. But I will say this, y'all, audience listening audience out there. When Jeff talks about the difference between these, like the difference between those who are disaffiliating and those who are joining, it is fascinating to me that we in the last couple of years have had the highest number of convert baptisms while also uh, arguably having the highest number of disaffiliation, right? And so I
Yeah.
decided I'm committing to you right now. This is not going to be something that Jeff and I spend more time on than we already have because I think it's just a side issue. But I actually was so intrigued with that topic. I've been giving that a lot of thought, and I'm going to commit an entirely separate episode on that with you to actually help look at that through the lens of psychology and human growth and development and propose to you why I think these things can both be happening and can both be
Love that.
true.
I would love that discussion.
Yeah.
And before now, as we move off this topic into the reasons people cite, I do want to. So I talked about how affiliation and disaffiliation can simultaneously happen. And Val, as you just said, satisfaction and happiness and spiritual fulfillment and an empty, unnourishing spiritual experience can also happen at the same time, right?
Yes.
And so there's been some good work done by some BYU professors, several of whom I know. The lead on the project is Justin Dyer, and Justin and I have talked many times. And Justin's recently released a paper that talks about a lot of the really good things that are going on inside the church with Latter-day Saints. And so it would be dishonest if I didn't acknowledge that there is a large group of members of the church that find their church experience terrific, and they're happy, they're fulfilled, there are all kinds of measures of abundance and vitality in their life. And simultaneously, there is a large group of people who are not experiencing those things, and those truths can be occurring at the same time and
What
are.
I Thank you for that. And what I think is this is a great practice in our critical thinking skills, right? Because again, it's so easy to want to just move into the binaries, right? In other words, if I am having a complicated experience, it's easy for me, if I'm being a very binary thinker, to either not acknowledge your experience if it's different than mine, or to think that you're not being honest with me, or that you're not having an authentic experience, or you're being deceived or something. And so what we're doing here in this particular part of our conversation is talking about how concurrently people can be having very different experiences, even in the same room of the same church on the same
Yes,
day. And
for sure.
and that has to do with a myriad of factors, but I would say overarching factor involved in that has to do with gender sometimes, right? I think that's a big piece, and
Yep.
that's a structural issue, but also with one's level of development. In other words, in a certain level of psychological, spiritual development, the needs of a certain kind of institution will serve well, whereas when one is in a different level of development, their needs are different. And so
Yes.
you can have two. The best metaphor I ever heard about this was imagine yourself with a friend or a partner sitting on the looking out on the deck of a cruise ship, looking at the sunset. One person having a blissful experience, the other one wanting to puke.
Yeah.
Both are
Yes.
true. Yeah.
By the way, usually I'm the one that's seasick on the cruise ship, right here.
Yeah.
You know?
All right. So Jeff, let's move over if
All
we
right,
may
should we jump into
to
the waves? So,
yes.
Valerie, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a macro overview of the four waves, and I'll talk briefly about why we chose the term wave, and then you guide me on how much depth you want to go into in each of the four waves. So, what we did is we did a lot of qualitative research, interviews, focus groups to understand, to just let people talk to us, tell us why you left. And I did that over many years actually. And so what I learned is that there appeared to be four basic categories that people most frequently cited. And so that's what we put into the survey, but we put a fifth option as well, none of the above. Okay. Now, what happens is when you place a survey, you usually place it with some beta testers. These are real people, but you're putting it out there with 100 people just to see how the survey is functioning and if the insights you're getting are useful or not useful. In other words, are the questions working? And so if we had gotten a lot of none of the above responses to that question, we would have said, okay, we have not captured the four categories that are most comprehensive here. So we need to stop and rewrite the question. But we got very few none of the above answers. So what that told us is, okay, these are probably four categories that are pretty descriptive for most people of why they stepped away. So number one was lifestyle. Okay. And so a bumper sticker version of that is, I just couldn't keep living this way. About 6%. Number two is church history. The church isn't what it claims to be. About 42%. Wave three was social issues. The bumper sticker would be, even if the church were true, I couldn't support this. About 33%. And then wave four was church experience. The church isn't led by Christ and it's not life-giving. About 18%. And so that gives you a little bit of a feel for the broad reasons and the degree of magnitude. And I'm happy to go into some depth now. Now, people have asked me, why did you choose the term wave? Wave is such a descriptive term because if you think about, for those of you that spend any time at the beach, the waves hit you in succession, right? They boom, wave one, wave two, wave three, wave four. And there's a cumulative effect of being hit by multiple waves, right? So in our research, it's very clear that there's typically no one single wave that is decisive. It's usually a primary wave, but there are also other waves that get involved. And so somebody might be affected by three or even four of these waves. The other thing is we can't prove this, nor are we trying to with the data, but the waves feel sequential to us. So wave one, lifestyle, it's true when some people say, hey, people have always left the church. Yes, that's true. And for the most part, it's been lifestyle related. And so we called that wave one. Wave two, church history, feels second to us. And that sort of hit with the advent of the internet around 2000 and kind of crescendoed through the decade. And I think since about 2010, there hasn't been a lot of new information that's come forward, but the community's still trying to process and digest what's already there. Wave three, social issues, that feels like a more recent wave, particularly LGBTQ, financial transparency, more recent. Now, a good friend of mine, Allison Dayton, said, Jeff, it is more recent, but at least in terms of sexual identity, it's probably because it was just kept underground before. So it's been there and it's just manifest publicly more recently. And then wave four, church experience, to me feels a little bit newer. And I think as the church gets bigger, uh, it's natural that it would have to fight off the tendencies to become more institutional as it grows in size. And I think as it grows in size and becomes more institutional, wave four becomes more of a factor. And so these waves interact in a very dynamic way. People are affected in a very personal and unique way by most of them. And we're trying to create a construct here that allows us to have a less complicated conversation.
So what I want to do, if I may, Jeff, is do you mind if I respond to that from the
Yeah,
perspective of my experience working with so many hundreds of people?
love that.
Okay, because I am going to respectfully push back. Is that okay?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay.
Please.
So the way I see this, or how I would conceptualize this, is I'm gonna move back to my construct of the upstream versus the downstream here. And my proposal is that when somebody enters into a faith crisis early on, it has to do with waves two and three. These are upstream issues. Okay, we're talking church history, social justice. So they're confronted with something that doesn't match the narrative. They go deeper in to sort of shore up their testimony to try to stay aligned. And then they run into more problems instead of less problems. And then, so that's wave two and three. And then my sense is that whilst experiencing this pain and suffering, so many people, and this is very common, and you mentioned this in your book, so many people, on the one hand, are in a great deal of pain connected to what they're like, what is the tension of what I thought the church was and what it now actually is as it becomes more complex, right? And yet at the same time, so many of us, myself included, I don't want to throw this big part of my whole identity out.
No.
In other words, it starts to feel like, okay, is there a way for me to differentiate enough from the church to where it does not fully define me and I start to have autonomous beliefs, but can I also belong in my own way and on my own terms? Okay, and this is exactly why you wrote your book, by the way. So you have these people that are wanting to authentically engage with their spirituality. They're wanting truth, they're wanting authenticity, they're wanting to redefine themselves as spiritual beings in a different way. And they try to do this in the context of their church experience, which is your wave number four. And so for so many people, as they try to do this, many of them find that they are not welcome.
Mm-hmm.
And then after that, after a sustained effort, then we move to what you're calling wave number one, which is I can't keep doing this anymore.
Yeah.
And that's not everybody. And there are people that are able to do this and are able to continue to contribute. These are often people who are deeply differentiated, who've worked through a lot of things and who have a lot of ego structure to be able to manage the complexity of what happens in the church building, or oftentimes, or sometimes I should say, I wish it was oftentimes, but sometimes you will find a congregation that is up to the challenge.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to think, based on what I've heard, that's more the exception than the rule. But be that as it may, these are just it doesn't matter, right? But it's just something fun
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
sort of talk about.
Yeah, no, hey, I everything you said, I love all that. I agree with
Yeah,
all that, and it's very consistent with what I've seen. And I think let me layer a concept on top of that that might help. I think the waves are reasons people cite, but not the process they go through.
sure.
And so, Valerie, you've seen this in the book, but I'll just briefly hit what appear to be the stages that people go through. So, number one is some kind of integrity disruption, right? Conscience is stirred. Number two, people give themselves permission to ask questions they didn't ask before because it felt disloyal or even naughty. And these are necessary questions. Number three, they go through this intense seeking process, and the effort intensifies, and the emotion and significance of this intensifies. And then number four is a fork in the road. If it all goes well and they're met with love and support and encouragement, their stage four doesn't happen. But if they're not, it's stage four is relational breaking. Trust and belonging are damaged, and then they probably step away, right? And they're going to continue the wrestle just somewhere else.
Yeah. And I think that's what you and I engage in terms of helping our beloved community feel as if they have more support than I think a lot of them are experiencing right now. And that's, I think, what the Torn book is trying to communicate. In other words, faith crisis, from my perspective, is not a problem. And faith crisis is actually a growth process.
Mhm.
And yet, at the same time, it can become a legitimate relationship crisis when it feels as if one's own trajectory is being rejected, and the very process of their growth is bringing about a whole separate kind of trauma.
Yes.
And
Yeah,
that
in the midst of that, and you know how painful this is for people. And so people that I've interviewed have literally said, this was like the death of my best friend, right? And trying to work through that. And I've heard other people say, this is like a really bad marriage that you stay in for the kids, you
yeah,
know. And so it to suggest that it's fast, easy, emotionally uninvolved, flippant, just exhibits terrible misunderstanding of what's really happening. And I
yes,
think you're aware that in our survey, 85% of people said they spent at least 100 hours over several years, and 49%, more than half of that group, spent uh, more hours than they could count over at least 5 years. Right? It is a very serious, thoughtful, intense process uh, that involves people who are deeply serious about their faith and their commitment and love for the church, and then they go on this journey.
yes. And I think if we could create a platform where people are able to confront these things, that, the downstream struggles as they currently stand, but to be able to do so in the context of an environment that holds them and loves them as they are, who they are, where they are,
Yeah.
it would be a very, very different experience, because what I see and witness is two crises. There's the crisis of identity and faith, but then there's the crisis of relationship and belonging.
Yes. You know, it's interesting. You're aware of this, but I'd love to share it with your listeners. So a good friend, Joseph Grenny, the founder of the Other Side Academy. Joseph is a wonderful human being, and man, if there's anybody on the planet doing God's work, I think it's Joseph. And he and I did a separate piece of research together to look at these conversations, these faith transition conversations that take place. And I won't give you all the details, but I'll give you one key point. It was fascinating to me that how faith transition conversations go. In other words, are they healthy? Are they productive? Uh, in our study, had a stronger determinant, or was a stronger determinant of whether somebody stays inside the LDS community than what they actually believe. So you have to let that sink in for a minute. How the conversation goes has a stronger impact on what they do than what they believe. So what that suggests is, even if they, through the faith transition process, lose literal belief in certain things, they're willing to stay in the community and continue to wrestle if they get support, right? But if they don't, they're going to take their wrestle somewhere else. And so whether people stay or whether people go, and some people need to go, that's the right choice for them, and that's what they need to do. But whether they stay or whether they go, a huge impact on that is how does the community respond as they're going through this process?
To me, this speaks to what is the purpose and value of a faith community. And I think that right there, to some degree, kind of hits at the nub of, like, the the point of faith community, from some of our perspectives, my perspective at least, is not uniformity of belief. Faith community is about supporting one's journey in one's encounter with the divine, within oneself, around oneself, and with, sort of the creator or the creation itself. And so, if we could redefine what faith community is for, then that makes space for everyone on their own respective journeys, inclusive of more devout, traditionally believing people that sort of follow whatever the kind of correlated belief system is, but also it extends welcome to people that are less traditionally believing, but are also welcome, even if and as they are becoming more diverse in their beliefs. Because what we're doing is we're changing the definition of the purpose of community. And again, I think that's what your book is sort of gently inviting your listeners or your readers to think about, because as it stands, a lot of people experience their Mormon heritage or their tradition as you are welcome if you either conform or stay silent, and you are not welcome as soon as you stop conforming or actually show up authentically. And that, of course, causes one to reflect upon how am I able to use this as a platform for my wrestle?
Yeah.
And for so many people, it legitimately doesn't feel like a safe space or a place where they can actually do this. And yet, at the same time, I would agree with you that for many people, they would prefer to be able to feel at home authentically growing and evolving. And that is why oftentimes you could argue that if I could show up, I actually have somebody in one of my groups who, and this is a beautiful success story. He is a professed, non-believing, active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And his ward knows this, and
Yeah.
they love him.
Yeah.
And he doesn't have to stay small. He doesn't have to posture. And he shows up authentically and lovingly and in his beautiful selfhood. Now, if we could take that one example and expand that, I think what we would find is a far more vibrant community of people that would actually be inviting more growth and differentiation, but also more unity and more love and compassion. So,
Yeah. And Valerie, you know that part of my goal here, I've been really clear. I think I've been very clear that I'm not trying to recruit people to come back to the church.
yeah,
I am trying to encourage Latter-day Saints to create a church community where more and more types of
yes,
people can feel at home and can be nurtured in their faith and belief inside the community. And so that's ultimately my goal. I had speaking of success stories, I got a beautiful email from a man, and I'll give you the short version of it. It's like we could do a whole episode on this incredible story, but this is a man that after examining a variety of different historical and social issues, no longer had literal belief in certain specific elements of the church, right? So it wasn't that he lost belief in its entirety, but there are certain specific things where he said, yeah, I just no longer believe that. And he took a little bit of a risk in his home ward, perhaps like your friend, and it didn't go well, you know. And so he and his family were largely marginalized in the ward. And credit to that family, they hung in there, and it was very painful. And long story short, after several years of difficulty and feeling very isolated and alone, a wonderful stake president started a conversation with them. And over time, the conversation evolved. And then eventually he said, I got a phone call from the stake president, and he said, would you and your wife please come in and visit with me? Now, he was a little worried because they were openly non-believers in certain ways. And he thought, I wonder if we're going to get scolded or, corrected. And the stake president brought him in and said, I'd like to call you to the stake high council. And he said, I feel inspired that this is the right thing to do. And I don't know why he felt inspired, Valerie, but I suspect that he knew this stake president was probably in touch with the members in his stake. He probably had a sense that there were many people in the stake that were wrestling with this issue. And he probably felt that a high council representative that could bring that perspective to the table might be able to make a difference.
Wow.
And then he sent me a copy of his first high council talk. And it was astonishingly beautiful and full of wisdom. And so there are success stories, and we can do this. And sometimes it's not quite so far out of reach as it might seem.
Yeah. What I care about, and I think what you care about, Jeff, is the creation of a community where it's more about belonging because we draw breath, because we're divine, because
Yeah.
we're children of God, than any sort of loyalty test or sense of fitting in because we are conforming. And I think the only way this can happen, as even like an aspiration, is for us to be having conversations to invite people to stretch just a little bit beyond what they're comfortable with, so that we as a community can sort of raise our overall center of gravity and become just a little more capable of stepping up, of growing up, of being more loving than we are used to being. I want to just close this episode today, if I may, by sharing with you all a story that reminds me of this very thing. Jeff just shared a story inside of the LDS tradition, which I loved. And I want to share one from a friend of mine shared. Okay, let me see if I can like give this some context, but not too much. I have a dear friend whose best friend, so friend of a friend, is Jewish. And I often think about these older, more mature spiritual traditions who have wrestled through these very same things, only they've done so, years, they've got far more years than we have as a very young, you know, less than 200-year-old spiritual tradition. And so this is a Jewish young man telling of his faith journey. At present, he is very, very active in his Jewish community. Non-literal believer, though. And he started this faith wrestle when he was a young boy. And he recalled, or he shares the story, that it was the day of his bar mitzvah that he was in complete crisis because he already had sensed that he was a non-literal believer and he had some questions and doubts. And so he had the courage to go into his rabbi and he says, I don't think I can go through with this. I don't think I believe all of the things that I've been taught in the sessions, preceding this event. And his beautiful rabbi looked into this little young man's eyes and he said, you don't need to worry about that. You have your entire life to wrestle with your belief. Today, we celebrate because you are part of our community. That's what I think this is about.
Yeah, I love that. And all I'll add to that is the things that you've articulated just acknowledge a deep human truth, which is we are different,
Yeah.
right? We are unique individual human beings. I believe that we're children of God, but I believe we're different, right? And so why would we not acknowledge and accommodate something that God created, right?
Yes.
And that's all we're really talking about here is making allowance for the fact that the way people experience belief, come to belief, and leave belief is deeply personal and unique to them based on who they are, how they think, the spirit inside them, and their life experiences. And can't we just honor and respect that?
That's right. I love that. We will pick up this conversation next week, everyone, as Jeff and I tackle part 2 of this 3-part series, where we're going to talk about deeper look into Jeff's book about why he has some of the research on, I'm trying to remember if it's research or some of the things I just sort of wanted us to talk about why some of our devout loved ones do struggle to see and take in what those of us on a faith journey are experiencing. Then after that, we're going to talk about how Jeff frames the book up around the concept of culture with an invitation to look at what is going on downstream and invite our culture to change such that it is more warm and welcoming towards those who are on a faith expansion journey. So stay tuned for that, and we will see you all next week. Take care. Thanks, Jeff.
You bet.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Latter-day Struggles. If this podcast has supported your faith journey, we invite you to explore the many ways you can continue your healing and growth with us. On our website, you'll find support and processing groups, marriage and parenting courses, and free resources to support where you are in your faith journey. You can also join Valerie in the live fellowship gatherings throughout the year, where we connect, process the podcast, and build meaningful friendships with others on similar paths. If cost has ever been a barrier, we offer podcast scholarships funded by listener donations. To explore all of these offerings, visit the link in today's show notes or go to latterdaystruggles.com. And if this podcast has been meaningful to you, leaving a 5-star review is one of the most powerful ways to help others find this work. Latter-day Struggles is proud to be part of the Dialogue Podcast Network.
Dialogue Podcast Network.